Coming up, the NFL trade deadline came, the NFL trade deadline went, and the New York Football Giants might as well have been on vacation or maybe just a bye week because they did not make any moves at the deadline. Joe Schoen did hold his press conference. We'll give some of the takeaways from that regarding the trade deadline opportunities and beyond, how he's feeling about this team and where they can go moving forward. Break that all down next. Yes, friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, we are your hosts over here, Adam Marbrick, breaking down the Brooklyn Nets on the Locked On Nets podcast with my boy, Doug Norrie. And yonder there, it's the season generational ticket holder, the healthy, wealthy, and wise Mr. Andrew Makowitz.
You know what's interesting, Adam? You talk about doing the Locked On Nets podcast. Mm-hmm. It's great when it's the NFL trade deadline day. The Giants have a flurry of activity. Everything is quiet on the Brooklyn Nets front. It just felt like a good, solid Tuesday for you, right?
I did a spot for the Locked On Network with Peter Bukowski, who does a lot of NFL coverage.
Packers,
and the
intro
right? In the intro to that conversation, Peter Bukowski is absolutely fantastic for all things NFL, and then some sports overall sports coverage too. But the opening was on the day when the NFL is supposed to be the narrative. We bring in Adam Armick for the Locked On Nets to talk about what's going on with Brooklyn. So yeah, they keep me on my toes.
Adam, I don't want to sidetrack it, but I've a bunch of stories are coming out, and I'm sure you've been, you're well in tune with the Nets. But I hear there was even like a story of Steve Nash went to Kyrie Irving's house, and Kyrie Irving made him stand out at the front door in the pouring rain for 30 minutes before answering the door just to see how long Steve Nash would actually wait on him for. Like, do you understand how crazy that is? Like, you must just be like, your head must be spinning. The Giants are 6-2. The Nets are 2-6. It feels like the upside down for you right now.
Yes. When you talk about where this began to where it is, I very much am battling whatever is swirling around my head. And potentially I'm just going to die out in the middle of the upside down and, have one glorious run, one season of beautiful just moments for me. And then much like Eddie, I go on to a better or possibly much worse place. The bottom line is the New York Football Giants and the NFL at large had the NFL trade deadline yesterday. Joe Schoen held a press conference at 4:30 to wrap up all the big moves that the Giants made. Spoiler alert, they didn't make any. But there were a handful here. So we're going to discuss why the Giants didn't make any big moves here. We understand, coming in, so many fans were talking about, right? Go out and get the wide receiver. Go get a Jerry Jeudy. Go get a DJ Moore. Go get a Michael Thomas. Like, just rattling off the list of high-profile guys. Now, you and I had discussions around the Callaways and the Josh Reynolds of the world, which nobody appreciated. But I think it was the much more realistic possibility for the New York Football Giants. Ultimately, nothing gets done here for Big Blue, but there were several moves around the league that I do think give you an indication of where some teams think they are right now and also about where they could be in years to come.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm okay with the fact that the Giants didn't make those moves. We had talked, like you just said, about the Reynolds and Callaways of the world. It was going to be a fringe move that slowly or slightly improved the team. Joe Schoen just came out and said, these deals were too rich for our blood right now. Like, they didn't make sense for where we are and what we are trying to build here. And when you see some of the other deals that came out around the league, let's just start with, I don't know, Adam, Chase Claypool, for instance, moving from the Pittsburgh Steelers over to the Chicago Bears for an early second-round pick. To me, that was surprising that they got that much for Chase Claypool, considering he's had some issues and he had some drops in his past. It felt like a hefty premium that the Bears paid, and they're not even farther along than the Giants are in terms of their rebuild.
Yeah, well, listen, I'll say it's interesting too, because you and I talked about Chase Claypool. He's a guy that I think schematically fits in with the Giants. I'm not saying I thought that Joe Schoen was going to be anywhere near giving up a second-round pick for him. But the other side of it that you bring up too is just Chicago, who is trying to continue to build themselves in a positive direction. We talked about Justin Fields when Chicago played them, but when you go inside his numbers these last couple of weeks, I think that the perception here now is hey, he's starting to get his feet underneath him a little bit more. You're starting to see the completion percentage go up. You're starting to see the touchdown to interception ratio go down. And even though they've lost 4 of their last 5 games, when you turn around and look at what is going on inside their division, I think Chicago says, oh, we very much can be in the discussions here, potentially to be making a wild card spot if we bolster something. And just like Giants fans, you want to do the 1-to-1, right? Giants fans would say, that's why Giants needs, again, for Daniel Jones to prove what he is or what he is not. And I'll take this moment on Chase Claypool and the wide receiver group as a whole to make the statement that I discussed over on social, and people were bringing it up. I said, whatever Daniel Jones is, whatever he's going to be, the New York Football Giants, Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll, they already know how they feel about Daniel Jones. It doesn't mean that bringing in a high-profile wide receiver wouldn't make Daniel Jones a better quarterback or wouldn't make the offense more explosive. Those are facts. However, they don't need that wide receiver to confirm or deny how they feel about Daniel Jones, for good or bad, for better or worse. What they've seen from him now, 8 games into this regime, I think that they understand what they have, and they can say, we'll make the move in the offseason, we'll make the move in the draft, and we'll improve this team accordingly, whether it's with or without Daniel Jones. I'm not hedging, I'm not putting anything on either side of this. I'm just saying that's the facts. And when you talk about saying, how are you going to evaluate a quarterback without having an elite wide receiver? There are 17 steps that happen before you throw the pass that you can confirm how the quarterback is playing. So if you've liked what you've seen from Daniel Jones, assume that behind the scenes, they love what they've seen, because there's all kinds of nuance that you're not picking up on. And if you've been okay on him, then the organization could also be saying the same thing. And they know, they have a very strong sense of where they're going to go in the offseason.
It also doesn't, I mean, this is not an indictment or us to go in on, is Daniel Jones the guy or not? Because
No,
that's
no,
for
no,
a
no.
whole nother day. But also, like, I don't know if Joe Schoen even thinks that it's that binary with Daniel Jones. I think what he says is, let's continue to build up this roster for sustained success, and let's see how that better roster looks overall. And then can we win with the compilation of people, or do we need something? Because like we just keep saying, and a lot of people are like, either he's the guy or he's not. It's like, well, can we build the roster up to a respectable situation? We know we still need offensive line and wide receiver and linebacker help before this team is ready to compete for a playoff berth and go deep and try to make a run. So what Joe Schoen was, and we'll get into it in a minute. Calvin Ridley was also another deal that could have been had out there, which was kind of a surprise one. Went from the Atlanta Falcons to the Jacksonville Jaguars. He is suspended this year, but he went for a 5th and a conditional 4th that will move down to a 2nd if they end up signing him to a contract extension. A lot of people were saying, why weren't the Giants in on that? And what I find funny about that is he's suspended for the year. So if you wanted the Giants to make a move in the short term, Calvin Ridley wasn't going to be the answer, because he wasn't going to be out there.
Yeah, I don't mind, like some people were saying, like I would pay that price. And I just said all the way up to that 2nd round pick. Again, like even if all those conditions get met, which means Calvin Ridley is having a very good season next year, and you like that, right? So say you want to make the move in the margins to prepare for next season. I'm not against the idea of that move for any player, let alone Calvin Ridley. But again, I'll go back to, I know how good Calvin Ridley can be. I'd still rather have the 2 and the 5 then ultimately, and be able to make moves on that, let alone
and 20 million in cap space too, like 25 million, because you're giving up the assets, and then all of a sudden you have Calvin Ridley. You got to give him 25 million instead of having those 2 cheap people under cost control.
And let's be honest, as we just will highlight one of these quotes here from Joe Schoen. If something made sense in regards to the position, we explored a lot of opportunities. We've been on the phone the last few days speaking on the wide receiver role specifically. But you touched on something there that I also think is worth noting, that the conversation is always, is Daniel Jones the guy or not? Now that made sense in other regimes, but now the way that you framed it is perfect. Again, like, yes, we all know the quarterback position is the most critical on the team, but the entire team is being evaluated. The entire team is being built up. The entire organization is being turned over. So it need not be, is he or is he not the guy? It can just be, Do we have a starting left tackle? Yes. Do we have a starting right tackle? Yes. Do we have a starting cornerback? Yes, right? We're just trying to check boxes, understanding how important the quarterback one is. You still got to check the other boxes, right? So you can still go through this evaluation process without making it an end all be all and making choices that ultimately could impact the team long term negatively to try to figure something out right now in this moment.
Think of it like this. The Green Bay Packers are complaining. Aaron Rodgers is upset they didn't make a deal because they don't have wide receivers right now.
Well,
So,
they
like,
got beat
even if
out
you
for
had
Claypool, by the way. It was assumed that Green Bay was on the doorstep of getting Chase Claypool.
Green Bay reportedly offered their second round pick, and they looked at the second round pick from the Bears and they said, who do we think is going to finish with the worst record? Who's going to get us a higher draft pick? They went with the Bears instead of the Packers, which I
I
thought
think
was
it's by the
fascinating.
way, I think it's stupid either way because now you said too, and we'll get off of this quickly. Second round pick from Chicago, high second round pick. Yeah, right now. But if Chase Claypool helps the team play better and they win more games, say they sneak into a wild card spot. I mean, either way, I think that a Green Bay or Chicago, you could be talking about a mid to slightly back end pick, potentially, depending on how it pans out. And that could be putting a lot of emphasis on what's going to happen with Chicago overall, let alone Chase Claypool. But you're hedging your bets around Justin Fields versus Aaron Rodgers if you give him the weapon, and then how that improves their team, obviously.
Right.
And
So
some people think Green Bay is going to get better even without adding a wide receiver. So
Right. So the simple thing I'll say, and then we can move off of this, Adam, is we talk about, oh, is he the guy or is he not? We always assume the two-time MVP Aaron Rodgers is the guy. Without wide receivers, they are struggling. Their team is not a good team right now. We look at Matt Stafford. We assume that he's the guy. He won the Super Bowl last year. That offensive line is so bad right now for the Rams that they can't function as an offense. Their run game is non-existent. And the last thing I'll say is we all know that Tom Brady is the guy. They can't establish a run game, and their offensive line is terrible. It goes to show that you could say we have the quarterback, but then when the rest of the team isn't functioning properly, you're not going to go anywhere. So the Giants are doing it smart. They're building from the ground up. They're saying we need to improve in every facet, and we'll figure out where that leaves us and what that looks like for our quarterback afterwards.
yeah, 100%. And so we'll see how things go here. This is what we thought was going to happen for the New York Football Giants. We didn't see a big splash move coming for them, and ultimately it did not occur. Moving into the Joe Schoen press conference a little bit more here, the problem is, as Joe Schoen mentioned when talking about being in on any player at any position, there are still a lot of teams that are still in it where we are in this season. So, not a lot of teams are sellers. Teams are banged up. There's not a surplus of players that are available. And I said this going back to when we were talking about looking around for where you can make moves. And you go, the Chicago Bears, the Green Bay Packers. They're not going to go anywhere. Okay, maybe they're not. But Denver Broncos, we want Hamler, we want Jerry Judy, right? All of these ideas, it was like, okay, we may look at them. Outsiders may look and say, that team is screwed this year. That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking we went and made big moves for Russell Wilson. They're thinking we still have Aaron Rodgers. They're thinking we've been in game. Any team across the league, we've been in games. We've been close. We've lost some. We've won some. Right? Chicago, we lost 3 out of our last 4 games, 4 of our last 5, and we're still a 3-4 team. Like we think that we can get back on track here. So perceptually, they're going to be far less likely to say, oh, you know what? It's not going so great. Why don't we go ahead and sell off a piece or two here? The only teams that made big moves were teams like Detroit, who gave up, and this was a pretty, to me, interesting one here. They gave up TJ Hawkinson, who is a young, dynamic, pass-catching tight end. And that went for what? I think a 2 and a 5 or something like that. Like it was a pretty hefty price tag too, which can also just be an insight overall. There was limited players available, and if you wanted one, you were going to have to pay a premium for them, and that makes it a lot easier, I think, for Joe Schoen to say, I'm all set. Like I just got a 3 and a 6 for Kadarius Toney, who hasn't even sniffed the field. I'm not about to start jettisoning high value assets to bring in someone.
Yeah, it did seem like an interesting move for Detroit to do that, but they are clearly sellers. That's why you thought Reynolds was going to be available. But look,
Yeah.
think about teams were holding out for as much assets as possible. The Houston Texans outwardly were like, we are shopping Brandon Cooks. And it sounded like the Cowboys were in till the last second. The Houston Texans held their line and were like, we're not going to trade him unless we get what fair compensation was. So Dallas didn't even blink as well. What I
Yeah.
find fascinating though is overall the top 4 teams with the best chance by ESPN analytics to win the NFC are the Eagles, the Cowboys, the 49ers, and the Vikings. The Eagles went and made a big trade for Robert Quinn to shore up the edge rush, as well as AJ Brown in the offseason. The Cowboys traded earlier in the past 7 days for Hankins to be able to shore up their run game and their run defense. The
I think
49ers.
though, I think that the Cowboys fell short in what they wanted to accomplish here at the deadline. Just to be clear, I think they're still a very good team, and they added Hankins, but they fell short. They wanted to add something here, and they weren't able to do it.
Right. But then the 49ers as well added Christian McCaffrey, which is a great move. And the Vikings have the fourth best odds. They added TJ Hawkinson.
Yep.
All four teams that are ready to compete and have a legitimate shot at winning the NFC decided to try and make moves. The Giants are not in that position. I know it is hard to say, Adam. We are 6-2. So everyone's like, Andy, you're crazy. We're 6-2. We're making the playoffs. How are we not
Andy,
pushing for
you're
that?
crazy. The
Right.
6-2, we're making the playoffs.
And guess what? The Giants' odds right now to win the AFC. I mean, to win the AFC is zero.
Zero. Zero's been a chance, yeah.
No possible. To win the NFC is less than 3.5%. It's actually 3.4%. So they have a 1 in 33 chance of being able to pull out all the stops and doing something there. Adam, it just, when you take a deep breath and you think about, are we one wide receiver away from going into Philly and going into Tampa and going other places to get to the Super Bowl? Like, is it worth it in the philosophical place to mortgage a good piece of the future where young, cheap talent can be on your roster for 4 years? I just don't. I don't know. You and I were in agreement. If they made a small move, we'd be okay with it. For what Chase Claypool went for, I'm very happy the Giants were not part of that.
Yeah, I said maybe, again, I said that's the compensatory third you got from Kansas City. Like, that was a maybe for me. And I said that Joe Schoen, I don't think was going to give up a fourth, at highest. Maybe he was only willing to give up a fourth round pick. And that's what we started to say. And you wouldn't expect that Chase Claypool, that Jerry Jeudy is available for a fourth round pick, right? So you have to start to compartmentalize yourself. Now, again, the 3% chance, that's to win the NFC and to go to the Super Bowl, right? So this doesn't take away the opportunity for the Giants to make the playoffs and to be a part of it. They have one of the weakest remaining schedules by NFL standards. But the funny thing is, too, what are the back end teams there? The Green Bay Packers are more likely to win the NFC, right? And there's one other team there at the back end. Who's that other?
The Bucs, the Rams, the Packers, and the Vikings are all more likely.
Right. So Vikings are, Vikings they have the record for it. And again, they also have the weapons at key positions where you feel like they're capable of doing that. And they went out and improved themselves as they are the team that got TJ Hawkinson from the Detroit Lions, a trade in division, by the way. So they went all in to give themselves a dynamic pass catching tight end to go along with their dynamic running / pass catching running back and their dynamic otherworldly all pro wide receiver, right? So they're surrounding Kirk Cousins, which is with as much talent as humanly possible, so they can hopefully go on this run. It's fine. Like, it's fine for me. It does not need to be, again, the all in have to go and sacrifice something that a year from now we could be looking back on, or 2 years from now we could be looking back on and saying, well, remember when you went and did X? That cost you the ability to sign player Y, or it forced you to have to do something you didn't want to. And then, by the way, even though we love Leonard Williams, right? That's what we talked about so much when that move was made in season. And that's when the Giants were bad and they were below 500 on the year. And it was, we're going to go get this guy for the pleasure of being able to try to bring him back. And that worked out in the long term. And also, you can go back and examine the previous regime and think about all the instances where you spent more money or you spent more draft capital and the mistakes sometimes that can compound when you miss somewhere else, which inevitably is going to happen. So last thing I want to touch on here from Joe Schoen before we talk about a very specific question that he was asked at the press conference. It takes 4 or 5 weeks, Joe Schoen said, I think, to truly figure out who your team is. What I'll tell you about our team is there's a lot of tough dudes that care about each other and love football. That is another important component to this. Not that it matters that you can't go get guys that love football, and that can be a bit of a cliche thing. But the Giants have built up a lot of cultural cachet over the start of this season with a lot of their players inside the locker room and with their coaching staff. Whatever is going to happen this year, obviously bringing in more talent can help, but the Giants are 6-2. They're having a bit of a fun ride this year already. Why rock the boat? Why rock the boat and shift anything around? And it feeds into the final part of this, which was, were the Giants getting any calls about players on their roster? Joe Schoen did say yes, on one player in particular, and it was, Andy, a hard no.
It was, and he didn't mention the player by name. And there's reasons behind why he didn't mention the player by name, obviously, and we'll get into that in a second. But most beat writers and everyone kind of reading between the lines believes that a team was calling about Saquon Barkley, asking if he was available. The thought process was if Joe Schoen knew that he wasn't going to sign him to a long-term deal after the season, and like you said, they may have already made up their mind on Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley. Maybe a team could catch the Giants and I don't know, a team like Buffalo who traded for Nyheim Hines. Maybe they trade for Saquon Barkley, give up their first round pick, and away they go. It's fascinating that Joe Schoen comes out and says a hard no. Did you have any initial thoughts about why he said the hard no on Saquon specifically, or why he phrased it that way?
Yeah, so if the presumption is that it was Saquon Barkley that was the hard no, and because I think I personally think that it almost 99% was Saquon Barkley because that's the most attractive piece, and you understand if you're a team that's going to rent him for a high asset price, it's only going to cost you for this season, and then he's off the books, and you can walk away if you want to, so you can go all in and not have any long-term ramifications like we're talking about with some of these moves for the Giants. But you can extend it out, I think, to a couple of other key players on this roster, like an Adoree Jackson, who's a high profile, playing at a high level at the cornerback position. You could even extend it to Dexter Lawrence, who's giving you all pro talent on the defensive front. There could be other players, but even if we say it's 100% Saquon Barkley, in the same way that Joe Schoen is telling you, it wasn't the season to push all the chips in and say, baby, we're going for it. Give me Jerry Jeudy. I'll give you everything we have, and we'll try to make that run to the playoffs this year. At the same token, he's also saying, I'm not willing to strip something away from what has been a very exciting, fun, and successful year to this point to satisfy a little bit extra of the process going into the offseason. Getting rid of Kadarius Toney, not a problem because he wasn't on the field for us. I didn't draft him, and he didn't necessarily fit into the culture that we were building. Saquon Barkley, as we've always known about him, by the way, since he was drafted, has always been, and I've always said this, he is the model player that you want to be the face of your franchise. He says all the right things, he does all the right things, and he's an electric talent when he's on the field. So to take away a piece like that would essentially be waving the white flag on the season. And it's kind of an all or nothing scenario to me. If you're going to say Saquon Barkley, it's a hard no, you are effectively saying it's a hard no on almost every player that's having a good year for us this season, because otherwise you're saying it's done and you might as well make moves on 5 or 6 guys as opposed to no one.
Listen, Joe Schoen has built up an immense amount of credit and cachet with ownership, with the fans, with the players in the locker room.
Yep.
He is right now, his stock is very, very high. If at 6-2, he decided, even for a very high draft pick, to trade Saquon Barkley away from this team after saying that he believes he's a foundational piece, after getting all the goodwill of the Giant fans excited about the direction of this team, it would change everything. It really would, because the fans would be like, we finally have a good team and you're selling our best players off. And like they could turn on the front office very, very quickly, Adam.
Well, by the way, I will say, if he had done that, it would have been a hard pill to swallow, and I would have completely understood it, right? And it doesn't mean that I'm thinking that they should do that. And this can be indicative of what is going to happen with Saquon Barkley this offseason. Almost safe to assume that he's back here next year by whatever process that may look like. But I would not be turning on the organization, understanding why the fan base would be upset about it. Because again, the smartest thing, because here's the two sides of the coin, right? What we're understanding at the trade deadline is this is still a rebuilding process for the Giants and Joe Schoen. They still know they have a lot of work to do. They may understand how they feel about Daniel Jones, but know what it's going to take with or without him to move forward successfully. And also that, you can say we could kickstart the rebuild even better if we had another 2nd round pick, another 3rd round pick, a 2 and a 5, right? Getting rid of Adoree, getting rid of Saquon, getting rid of Dexter if you're not going to bring him back, like even though you have him on the 5th-year option, right? Getting rid of a Julian Love who's having a very good season for himself, right? You could start stripping away all of the holdover pieces from the previous regime, knowing you already have some of your young talent in place. You could do that. And I would get it. And by the time we got to next year's draft, fans would be thinking differently about it because you would have 20 draft picks and you would have all that cap room. However, I think this was the smart move to stand pat, to play this season out, to continue to win football games. And by the way, just because I think they're still in a rebuilding process doesn't mean that I don't think that they need to be making the playoffs this year, right? That it's a both end, man. It's a funky spot to be in. And for all intents and purposes, I think Joe Schoen has walked that line pretty successfully this year.
I think by saying what he said and letting people know where things were at, he was explaining that we are in a rebuild, but we're not tearing everything down to the studs. Like that was what he was saying. He was saying we still have to improve in order to compete for a title, for a Super Bowl. We have to get better in all over this roster. If he would have singled, to your point, if Saquon Barkley gets traded, you tear it down to the studs, you get as many assets as you can, and you go into next season saying, we need to rebuild this thing from the top. I think Joe Schoen is saying we're not that far away. We're not one wide receiver away from competing for a championship, but maybe we're one draft class away from competing. And Saquon Barkley can be a part of that future team in the next 1, 2, 3 years. And so I think by him signaling that, he was saying, I see him as part of it. I don't think we're that far away, but we're certainly more than just one piece away from this whole thing.
Well, and that would be the final note we can make on that too, is like, it's what was the offer, right? It's
Well,
very
yeah, we don't
easy
even
to have.
know. It's
Here's
a hard no,
no.
like a 6th round pick, right?
Right. Hey, we'll give you a 5th rounder for Saquon. I go, well, a hard no then. I make that a very hard no. So that there is also that factor. Now, I don't think when it comes to Saquon, short of if you're saying we're going to give you a first round pick this year and a first round pick next year, or a first and a 2, a significant draft capital, which is going to be hard for any team to commit to unless you're really in that desperate mode, right? Short of that, it's also easy to say hard no to these things because, again, the pass is always relative to what the offer is. Same way, even Kadarius Toney. If Kansas City said, we'll give you a 6th round pick, period, stop, it's a hard no. It's a hard no. He's too talented. He's too talented just to take a 6th round pick. A 5 and a 6. No, no, hard no. 3 and a 6. Well, it turns out we're not, we're willing to part ways with Kadarius Toney.
It's like my cousin Vinny, like, I strenuously object. It's like, oh, so you strenuously object.
Yes.
Okay, as opposed to just object. It's not just a no, it's a hard no.
Hard no, I say.
You're like, what was that? What was it? Yeah, hard no on a 6th rounder, obviously. Okay, Adam, I think there's one other important thing. We know it was Saquon Barkley, but he didn't mention him specifically by name in that. And I think that was by design because there is a lot going on with Saquon as we approach the offseason. He's probably going to want a big, massive extension, get paid as one of the top 5 running backs. When they asked about what Saquon has done so far this year, Joe Schoen also gave a very interesting answer where he gave him praise, but he also kind of made sure to wrap it in a team aspect. And Adam, stop me if it takes too long, but I want to give the quote from Joe Schoen, okay? He says, Saquon's a great kid. He's tough. He obviously is talented. It's a team game. I think him being healthy this year, you've kind of seen who he is and what he can do, whether that's catching the ball or running the ball. Again, it's credit to the offensive line and the receivers blocking for him. And he's taken advantage of those opportunities with his God-given talents, and they've helped us a lot. So I'm pleased with where Saquon has gone.
That's right.
Talk about being like, he's great, but thank the offensive line. He's explosive, but those wide receivers are blocking great. Joe Schoen knows that he cannot say it's a hard no on trading Saquon Barkley, and he can't heap too much praise on him because at the end of the season and at the end of the day, we know that Saquon's agent would just hand that piece of paper back over to Joe Schoen and be like, was this you? This was you, right? Like a couple weeks ago? Just let me know what this equates to financially for us.
Now, I have you down here, Joseph Schoen, as saying Saquon Barkley is the only reason that we have won any football games this year. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Right. So again, like we talk about, there's been some times, Joe Schoen hasn't had a perfect tenure, already. And I don't mean that negatively. It's just no GM does. Right. But by and large, he's made a lot of smart moves. He's done things the right way. And this is doing it the right way because coming up over these next couple of episodes and into next week, we are going to touch on the fact that when he was asked about, are there any extensions, any extension talks that you may get into? He said, if I'm going to, it's going to be now. It's going to be in the bye week. So we're going to break that down in bigger detail here coming up. But when you're setting the table for it, what you don't do is say, I really think that Daniel Jones on a better team would probably be a Pro Bowler. Yeah, I think that Daniel Jones, he's probably something around a $45 million a year, quarterback, right?
You wouldn't say Daniel Jones is a top 5 quarterback in the league, because then you're like, oh, okay, well,
by every measurable, especially by the dollar,
financially,
I
yeah.
think that Daniel Jones, yeah, exactly. So, you are hedging your bets here, and you're doing it in a way that is both incredibly complimentary. So you're not slighting Saquon Barkley here, but you're guarding your words carefully to understand when we come to the negotiating table, it is going to be about, and I honestly believe that Joe Schoen does believe this. Like, as good as Saquon has been, we know the running back is a fickle position, and year to year, you can all of a sudden have someone show up and play very well for you. And then you can have the Christian McCaffreys and the Saquon Barkleys and the elites of the elites that you see just with your eyes. They're a different level of player at that position. So I think there is honesty there. It is a team game, and the team is getting better. And by the way, Saquon Barkley has looked better this year with better line play. I mean, that actually is a fact, right? The offensive line has been very good in run protection. So he looks better. He looks more dynamic. He looks more explosive. All these things are going to matter. And I think the theme remains that it is about building the team as a whole. And the message that Joe Schoen, Brian Daboll, and this coaching staff have said from day one is that it's about putting in the effort and being rewarded for the hard work. And that's universal across the board. There's always going to be more talented players, and it's always easier to make these statements when you think you know what your ceiling is in a given year. But they're honoring that right now, and we'll see how that plays out over the rest of the bye week.
I love it, Adam. It's nice to know that we don't have a Giants game this weekend. The team can get a little bit healthy, and we can focus on some of the philosophical things, bigger picture things about this amazing start to the Giants. You mentioned it, the extensions for a couple of key players. It'll be interesting to bat that around a little bit, see what the OGP listeners are thinking in terms of guys like Julian Love and Dexter Lawrence and others. So I think we can also talk about historically and philosophically, Joe Schoen's done a great job, but there are still a lot of Dave Gettleman guys that are contributing to this 6-2 start.
Yeah. Listen, talented players, right? You put a talented player in a good spot, you see how good coaching, great coaching, can help improve the roster and the perception of a team. So we'll continue to break that stuff down. There'll probably be other fallout here from the trade deadline and some other players we can look at and what teams did. Now, by the way, we'll see how these players look and how they make quarterbacks look and how they make teams look. And I'm sure fans are going to be upset that they didn't make a move, and potentially even more upset when they see them having success other places. But hey, as Andy Makowitz said, we get a week off. And in some ways that feels really good because there's a lot of angst going into a weekend when the New York Football Giants play. That being the case, get over to YouTube, where obviously we're doing this thing 5 days a week. You subscribe, you share it with your friends, you tell your grandparents, you give them a kiss on the cheek at the holidays, and you say, hey, guess what? Whisper in their ear, One Giant Podcast. They won't get it, but they'll get it. And then you go over that podcast feed where we get those needs fulfilled. Until next time, though, as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.